Hi guys, Artie here, and today we are going over the top 10 worst South Park episodes in my own personal opinion. I originally wanted to go for a top 5 list because it's more digestible for viewers compared to a top 10 list, but I found more distasteful episodes I want to talk about. I've also wanted to do a top rankings video for a while now, since it's a fun format to work with, so why not give it a shot? I also chose South Park because unlike other popular series such as SpongeBob or The Simpsons, where there's a common consensus, meaning most fans collectively love or hate a certain episode, while South Park episodes are more open to interpretation and contain multiple messages within one episode. So there's more debate, varied opinions, and it's harder to argue which episodes are the worst and best. Well, except for season 20, most fans agree that it's rock bottom. I'm also ranking these episodes based on how bad they are in quality in my personal opinion, and not by how outrageous or offensive it is. Without further ado, the 10th worst South Park episode is Season 2 Episode 7, City on the Edge of Forever, Flashbacks. Yep, that's right, South Park has one and only clip show episode. On the way to school, the bus is stuck hanging off of a cliff because Miss Crabtree took a dangerous detour. She seeks out help and gets distracted by becoming a comedian and hooking up with some guy. Meanwhile, the boys stay put on the bus while recounting past memories in the wrong way, not leaving because they fear they will be eaten by some scary monster. And that's it. Not much happens here, so you aren't missing out on anything. There's nothing really else for me to say. Actually, I'll say the visuals are pretty cool, especially with the shot of the school bus falling off the cliff and the camera angle going through each side of the bus. The reason why I put this higher on the list is that there's more original footage than actual flashbacks in the episode. Besides, the flashbacks have alternate endings involving ice cream each time, which was one of the only funny moments here. Spoiler alert, the whole episode was a dream, so it was all for nothing. They pulled a Super Mario Bros. 2 on us. It's not that bad of an episode, but overall mediocre. It's a relatively early episode, and like other Season 2 and 3 episodes, they were still finding their footing. The 9th worst South Park episode is Season 18 Episode 1, Go Fund Yourself. Many of you are going to disagree with me for this, but I really don't like this episode. This episode is really boring and is not all that funny. It's just the same joke told over and over again without raising the stakes. It's not all that eventful or even impactful either. What is the message even supposed to be here? I guess it's a decent commentary on why crowdfunding doesn't work and is a scam most of the time. So in this episode, the main 4 boys plus Butters begin a startup company only because they want a cool edgy name. They can't come up with one until Cartman realizes the trademark for Washington Redskins got pulled, so he goes with that. This pisses off the actual Washington Redskins, now the Commanders, who do all they can to stop them. The payoff isn't until the very end, making it a slog of an episode to get through. I'll admit, I chuckled at the ending scene where even ISIS boycotts Cartman's startup company because of media hysteria. Other than that, it's a nothing burger of an episode that's uninteresting and boring. The 8th worst episode of South Park is Season 12 Episode 2, Funnybot. The funny thing about this episode is that despite the name, it's just not funny. The whole episode is the joke about the stereotype that Germans aren't funny. Jimmy, along with a special needs class, host a comedy award show, which nobody cares about at first, but catches wind of the German government because he nominated all of Germany as the unfunniest people on Earth. In retaliation, they threaten the entire school and deploy Funnybot in order to prove they have a good taste in humor. It takes the world by storm, but Funnybot becomes out of hand once it starts massacring people and attempting to nuke the world in order to tell one big practical joke. The boys are able to put a stop to Funnybot using the paradox malfunction trope, which they even point out. If you're gonna make fun of a group of people, at least do it in an entertaining, enlightening, or most importantly, in a funny way. The saving grace for the episode is the moment when Cartman tries negotiating with the Germans by attempting to sacrifice Kyle to them. Also, you could say that Funnybot foreshadowed AI-generated comedy and how robots can put people out of work, which they've done in future episodes. Not terrible in a decent story, but overall a weak episode with dry, lame humor. I know that's kind of the point, but it doesn't make for a good episode. Jumping several seasons forward, the 7th worst episode of South Park is Season 21 Episode 1, White People Renovating Houses. This was immediately after the Season 20 story arc, and you could tell they were trying to find their footing once again. Unfortunately, it doesn't work here. They got me in the first half of the episode with the boys messing around with Amazon Alexa. Yep, this episode is pretty dated by 2024 standards. The last time I heard anybody mention Alexa was probably 2019 or 2020. However, the rest of the episode is very weak. Anyways, the main plot is about Randy and Sharon having their own TV series where they renovate houses, and most of it is just Randy tearing down the wall between the living room and the kitchen for a more open living space, and this joke becomes really tiresome. Also, the hillbillies rage a war against them because automation is taking their jobs. This plot piece feels pointless because they already did something similar in the episode I'm a Little Bit Country, which is a much better episode. In the second half of the episode, the plot meanders and nothing is accomplished. The subplot is more of Cartman manipulating Heidi, which we've already seen before and it's unpleasant to watch. There's really nothing else to it. Just an overall unfunny episode that doesn't go anywhere with dated references. It's kind of interesting to see the rednecks trying to replace Alexa, but I can't think of anything else notable about this episode. The 6th worst South Park episode is Season 11 Episode 6, D-Yikes. This episode is just yikes. As it says on the tin, Mr. Garrison-centered episodes have never really been the best of South Park, as he cannot carry an episode by himself. The first half is okay, with the boys hiring Mexicans to do their homework for them because the teacher was in a bitchy mood over a bad date, but the second half has nothing to do with the main 4 boys. The rest of the episode is solely about Mr. Garrison connecting with lesbians at their bar. However, the conflict sets in when the bar owner sold it to Persians who want to take over the bar. The jokes aren't bad. I'm not gonna lie, the joke with the Mexicans confusing the word essay as in a report and thinking the boys meant the Spanish term essay, meaning man. The reason why I don't like this episode is because Mr. Garrison is weird and the story isn't all that interesting compared to everything else South Park has to offer, and is rather forgettable. This episode could not hold my attention and got more boring as the story progressed. The 5th worst episode of South Park is Season 20 Episode 7. Oh jeez. This is going to be a tough one to review. In order for this one to make sense, I have to give an overview of Season 20. The creators, Matt and Trey, wanted to experiment with serialization on a larger scale by having an overarching story this season. The most crucial plot thread is the trolling, with Cartman and Heidi dealing with a gender war and Mr. Garrison becoming president being the subplots throughout these 10 episodes. I could only pick one episode from the season, so I chose Oh Jeez, because they had no choice but to rewrite the episode at the last minute, causing the final product to be a sloppy, hasty, rushed mess. Not only that, but the episode has the most to do with the election arc, which I didn't care for at all. To be honest, I hated it. I can't stand it and wanted to see more of Gerald's trolling conflict get out of hand and escalate. It's also stupid how Randy changes his political stance off screen. For whatever reason, whenever South Park writes themselves into a corner, they use "the character was under mind control" as a cop-out. At the end of the season, you don't even know what they're satirizing anymore, or what their stance on these 3 plot pieces are. Well, except for the election, which is blatantly obvious. In Season 21, everything is abandoned and unresolved, except for Cartman and Heidi's slipping relationship. This whole season overall was very sloppy and is extremely dated. Even back then it was a bit dated and out there. You all probably already know this, but this episode had to be rewritten because Matt and Trey assumed that Hillary was going to win the election, but that didn't happen. The trolling arc with Gerald is awesome. The arc with Cartman and Heidi about boys versus girls is alright, but I disliked the Mr. Garrison as president plot thread loosely holding everything together like a wet spaghetti noodle. It straight up sucked. It makes me want to go back and watch a Season 4 episode. I'm really glad the creators decided to never do serialization or story arcs ever again, and instead stick with an overarching theme in the seasons after this. As for the humor itself, it's the same handful of jokes repeated throughout the entire season, and it gets stale real fast. The member berries talking about Star Wars was annoying, as well as Cartman repeating the same lines throughout. Not to get into politics, but it's ironic that South Park of all things would begin to peddle the mainstream narrative. The whole season felt like a 3.5 hour long episode if you watch it in order. If you happen to watch it out of order because you tuned into Comedy Central while a random episode was playing, It was worse because you didn't know how everything got to that point or where it started. There's too much going on at once and it's too complex, even for South Park standards. This part of the video took me the longest to work on more than everything else combined. One final note I want to make regarding Season 20 is why couldn't they just at the very least have a separate episode for each story arc? Maybe 2, instead of having each of the 10 episodes flip-flop between these 3 plot threads. And have the rest of the episodes in the season be new, original storylines that are not about current events. Now that we got that headache out of the way, the 4th worst episode of South Park is Season 26, Episode 6, Spring Break. That's right, a third Mr. Garrison-centered episode. He can never really carry an episode on his own, I'm telling you. He works better as a plot device or to assist a character, but cannot stand on his own. To describe this episode in one sentence, it feels like a Season 20 relapse, but without the trolling arc and instead about Garrison Trump. The main plot itself is about him and his new boyfriend Rick going on vacation to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. But Garrison is carried away by his supporters and starts rallying again, disappointing Rick. Meanwhile, the subplot centers around Randy acting like a drunken idiot because his son doesn't want to party hard for spring break, with Randy fearing he'll become effeminate from playing board games. I swear sometimes Randy reminds me of my actual dad. Anyways, this subplot is a commentary on Andrew Tate going to jail around that time, and is slightly more interesting than the main plot, which is not saying much. The saving grace of this episode is the speech Mr. Garrison gives at the end of the episode about accountability in relationships, the only redeeming quality. The 3rd worst episode of South Park is Season 10, Episode 5, A Million Little Fibers. You probably saw this one coming a mile and a half away. This episode is notorious for not only being one of the most boring episodes of South Park, but also having nothing to do with South Park. To sum it up, Towelie now lives in Chicago for some reason and is struggling to pay rent, so he writes an autobiography, but has to change it to be about a person and not a towel, in order for it to be published. When the book hits the market, he is invited on the Oprah Winfrey Show and somehow her private parts are sentient and wants her to quit her job for reasons. Eventually people find out the truth and want to go after Towelie for lying, and so everyone lynches him. It's a clusterfuck and a complete mess of a story, and it ends with, you know what, holding people hostage. So Towelie must save the hostages and learns he shouldn't get high all the time. This is one of the few episodes of the whole show not to feature the main 4, Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman. I'm glad I don't have to rewatch this episode ever again. I believe the first half of this episode as a concept works on paper, but actually executing this makes for one of the most lame episodes of the series. There's not even a subplot. This episode was very difficult to get through. I would zone out and get distracted and then have to rewind it again. If you want a better Towelie-centered episode, check out either the episode titled Towelie that introduces him, or Crippled Summer. The 2nd worst episode of South Park is Season 4, Episode 14, Pip. This episode is so bad I don't even want to bother rewatching it. I consider it a waste of time. I appreciate Charles Dickens for what it is, but this is the most boring episode out of the entire series without a doubt, and why I placed it so low. Just like with A Million Little Fibers, it has nothing to do with South Park. This episode is basically a retelling of Great Expectations, which is surprisingly very faithful to the original book. The visuals they made for this episode are cool and all, but this is one of the most boring pieces of media I've covered on my channel. It's up there with Rick and Morty the anime. What makes Pip better than that is at least there's a coherent plot here. If you're a fan of Charles Dickens or the novel Great Expectations, I say go for it, but this is not my cup of tea and was the biggest snore fest of my life. I'd rather go outside and watch a snail slowly move across the pavement than watch another second of this episode. It felt like hours. I'm never gonna get those 22 minutes back in the hours of writing this. Before moving forward to number 1, I want to get one honorable mention out of the way. For the honorable mention, it's Season 8, Episode 14, Woodland Critter Christmas. Stan encounters a group of animals who can talk and unknowingly assists in the birth of the Antichrist, believing he's helping them prepare for Christmas. Once he discovers their true intentions, it is up to him 3 mountain lion cubs, and Santa Claus to put a stop to their satanic ritual. At the end, the animals use Kyle to host the Antichrist because he's Jewish. However, he is saved because the 3 mountain lion cubs perform an abortion on him. It's a very bizarre, yet hilarious episode. As a kid, I really did not like this episode because it was unnecessarily creepy and dark, and I thought Stan really couldn't carry a story on his own. Upon rewatching it years later, I could not help but laugh most of the episode. I completely forgot the twist toward the end of the episode where it is revealed the whole episode was a story told by Cartman in class. This episode is too hilarious to hate on. If you're a fan of creepypastas, you'll probably like this episode. I'm a fan of dark takes on Christmas, such as the Krampus movie, and the American Dad Christmas specials. And the #1 worst South Park episode of all time is Season 10, Episode 1, The Return of Chef. In my opinion, this is the absolute worst episode of the entire show, and nothing else can top this. I hate it. Chef wants to escape his dull life, so he joins the Super Adventure Club, which turns out to be a cult that brainwashes him to become, a pedo. The boys work together to get him back in the right state of mind, which works at first, but he is kidnapped by the club and they have to break him free. At the last moment when they escape and are on the other side of the bridge, the cult convinces him to come back. As he walks back, lightning strikes the ladder, causing him to catch on fire, fall down the mountain, impaled by a rock, and then is mauled alive by a wild animal. This is a horrible episode and a terrible way to send off a longtime beloved character. I understand they were trying to tell a message about cults and Scientology, but they did this in the worst way imaginable. And it was disrespectful to Isaac Hayes. How would you feel if they did this with Stan, Kyle, Kenny, or Cartman? Well, maybe not Cartman, but you get the point. At least Pip is just an inoffensive, boring one-off episode that serves no purpose for the series. Meanwhile, The Return of Chef is actively damaging to the rest of the series. I try to pretend that this episode never existed because it is a horrible send-off to Chef, who's been in the show since the start. They really could have done this in a much more funnier or respectful way. Scientology is a truly terrible cult you do not want to mess with. I don't care if I get demonetized for saying that, because it's true. This episode had not one joke that made me laugh or even smile. It's disturbing and depressing. Not many people know this, but Chef's voice actor did not actually disapprove of the Trapped in the Closet episode, and the statement was made by one of his associates. At that time, he recently suffered a stroke and was not in the right state of mind to make decisions on his own. His associates, who were Scientologists, forced him to quit the show. Really sad circumstances, especially how he was taken advantage of when he was most vulnerable. And there you have it. That's my list of the top 10 worst episodes of South Park. After reviewing all these episodes, I noticed that a common theme among these episodes is that they're not god-awful bad, but more so bad because of how boring and uneventful it is, and the story and humor falls flat. The truly bad ones were the episodes that either had nothing to do with South Park or the main 4 boys, or went against what the show stood for. Not to mention, the worst episodes were mainly experimental ones that failed, and the show moved on. Sadly, there is not going to be any new episodes until 2025, in order to avoid another Season 20 type situation, but I'm still looking forward to Season 27. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, notify, and check out other videos on the channel. You may like them. In your opinion, what is your least favorite South Park episode? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for 4,000 subscribers.